Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. My cousin was obsessed with exposing a government cover-up about Area 51. He vanished 6 months ago, but I just found his journal hidden in my house. I'll admit, I wasn't super close to my cousin Eric. He was more like that one family member you see during holidays. The one everyone agrees is a little out there. The guy loved conspiracy theories, flat earth, chemtrails, you name it. Eric had a well-researched theory about it. But his obsession with Area 51, that was next level. He didn't just believe in aliens, he knew something sinister was going on there. And when I say obsessed, I mean the dude had maps, documents, and probably more tinfoil hats than I could count. 6 months ago, Eric disappeared. It wasn't exactly surprising. He'd been ranting about how they were watching him for weeks before it happened. My family assumed he just went off the grid, maybe got too deep into one of his rabbit holes. Honestly, I didn't give it much thought. Eric was always kind of a loner, and the idea of him packing up and ghosting us wasn't far-fetched. That is, until last weekend. I was cleaning out my attic when I found something weird. My house used to belong to Eric's family, so it's not unusual to find old stuff of theirs lying around. But this was different. I was moving some boxes when I noticed a loose floorboard near the corner. I figured it was just wear and tear, but curiosity got the better of me. I pried it up with a crowbar, and there it was, a black leather journal, tucked away like someone didn't want it to be found. The thing is, the journal wasn't dusty or decayed like I'd expect from something left in a floorboard for years. It looked recent, fresh, like someone had stashed it there not long ago. My stomach dropped when I opened it. The first page had Eric's handwriting all over it, messy, frantic scrawls that just said, "If you're reading this, they're probably already watching you too." Not gonna lie, I almost put it back right then and there, but something about it pulled me in. The next few pages were all diagrams, notes, and random words that didn't make much sense. Coordinates, timestamps, weird acronyms like MJ12 and GREY protocol. It was like trying to decode a madman's ramblings, but the further I read, the more I realized. Eric wasn't just theorizing about Area 51. He was trying to expose something. The entries got more coherent. Or maybe I was just getting used to his chaotic style. He wrote about a deep web forum where he'd been talking to someone named Synapse. According to Eric, this Synapse person claimed to be an ex-government contractor who had worked on classified projects involving non-terrestrial biological entities. That's the phrase he used over and over. Eric believed this guy was legit because he'd apparently sent Eric a link to a video. But here's the thing. Eric never described the video in the journal. He just wrote, "I shouldn't have clicked it. God help me. I shouldn't have clicked it." And then there was the drawing. About halfway through the journal, I found this sketch taped to one of the pages. It looked like some kind of humanoid figure, but the proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, head too small, and these huge, black, almond-shaped eyes. But what freaked me out the most wasn't the drawing itself. It was the note scribbled underneath it. Saw this outside my window last night. Not a dream. At this point, I was starting to get that feeling. You know the one, like when you are alone in a room, but you're suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow and sound around you. Yeah, that. I kept telling myself it was just Eric being Eric. He'd always been dramatic. But then I flipped to the last page. It wasn't like the others. There were no notes or drawings, just one sentence written in block letters across the entire page. They know. I don't know why I didn't stop reading earlier. I mean, what kind of sane person finds a journal like that and keeps going, right? But I couldn't help myself. It was like a train wreck. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't look away either. I ended up bringing the journal downstairs and flipping through it again, trying to make sense of the madness. And that's when I noticed something I'd missed before. Stuffed between 2 pages was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't part of the journal, just something Eric had jammed in there, like an afterthought. When I unfolded it, I realized it was a hand-drawn map. It showed a stretch of desert, not labeled or anything, but I could see a single red X marked near the bottom corner. Next to it, Eric had scribbled the words, "I found it." I should have stopped there. I should have tossed the journal, burned it, whatever. But I didn't. Instead, I grabbed my laptop and started Googling the coordinates Eric had written on one of the earlier pages. They were in Nevada, not far from Area 51. And here's the kicker. When I pulled up satellite images of the area, there was nothing there, just sand and rocks. But the closer I looked, the more I noticed something weird. A faint outline, like a structure, almost. But it wasn't visible unless you zoomed in at just the right angle. It didn't match anything on the map either. No roads, no buildings, no landmarks. Just nothing. That's when the power went out. It was sudden, like someone had flipped a switch. My entire house plunged into darkness, and for a second, I just sat there, frozen, listening to the hum of silence. Then my phone buzzed. A text. No name, no number, just a single message. Stop. I swear, I don't scare easily. I grew up binging horror movies, playing creepy video games late into the night, but sitting there in total darkness, staring at that text message, yeah, I was scared. My hands were shaking so bad, I almost dropped my phone. The thing is, I don't get service in my house. Like, at all. The only way I even text people is through Wi-Fi. And the Wi-Fi was out along with the power. So how did that message even get through? I told myself it was just a glitch, some leftover connection before the outage, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't random, that someone knew exactly what I was doing. I locked my phone and stood up, feeling my way toward the kitchen for a flashlight. That's when I noticed it. The house wasn't totally dark. There was this faint blue glow coming from upstairs, like someone had left a TV on in one of the bedrooms, except I knew for a fact I hadn't turned anything on. My brain immediately jumped to the worst conclusion. Someone was in the house. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, which, embarrassingly, was a half-empty wine bottle, and started creeping up the stairs. The glow was coming from my office. Now, my office is basically just a glorified junk room. I don't use it for much besides storage and the occasional Zoom call, and I was positive I hadn't been in there that day. But when I pushed the door open, there it was, my laptop, sitting on the desk, screen glowing like nothing had happened. The power was still out, but somehow the laptop was on. And it wasn't just on, it was open to that satellite map I'd been looking at. Except now, the coordinates were gone. The red X, the faint outline of the structure, all of it had disappeared. It was just blank desert, the way it looked on every other map. I clicked around, refreshing the page, zooming in and out, but there was nothing, like it had been wiped clean. Then I saw the message pop up. It wasn't an email or a text. It just appeared in the corner of the screen, in plain white text, against a black background, like someone had hacked into my computer. This is your only warning. Do not proceed. I slammed the laptop shut so hard, I thought I might have broken it. My heart was racing, and all I could think about was getting out of the house. I didn't care if it was some elaborate prank, or if Eric had somehow set this up before he disappeared. Whatever was going on, I wanted no part of it. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the front door. By the time I got to my car, the power in the neighborhood was still out. The streetlights, the houses, everything was pitch black, except for the headlights of my car as I pulled out of the driveway. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to move. The journal was still sitting on the passenger seat, and I kept glancing at it like it was some kind of cursed artifact. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something weird. My car's clock, which always synced to my phone, wasn't working. The display just showed a bunch of random symbols, like hieroglyphics or something. And then the radio started acting up. It wasn't like static or interference. It was this low, humming noise that almost sounded like a voice. I turned the volume all the way down, but the hum didn't stop. It was coming from somewhere inside the car. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to figure out what was going on. That's when I saw the headlights. They were in my rearview mirror, about 100 feet back. 2 blinding white lights, just sitting there on the road, not moving, not honking, just watching. I couldn't make out the car itself, just the lights. For a second, I thought it might be a cop, but there were no flashing reds or blues, just those 2 bright beams, like eyes boring into me. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I grabbed the journal and started flipping through it, desperate to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. My fingers landed on a page near the middle, where Eric had scribbled something that didn't make sense to me at first. They use the lights to track you. Don't let them get close. The second I read that, the headlights started moving. Slowly, almost lazily, they crept forward, closing the distance between us. My instincts screamed at me to floor it, but my brain kept throwing up warning signs. What if they wanted me to run? What if that's exactly what they were waiting for? I reached over and killed the engine. The humming noise in the car stopped immediately, but the lights didn't. They kept inching forward, slower than ever, until they were about 20 feet behind me. At this point, I couldn't even see the road ahead. The glare in my mirror was so bright, it practically blinded me. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the lights flickered and vanished. I don't mean they drove off or turned down a side road. They just disappeared. 1 second they were there, and the next, I was sitting in complete darkness again, my own headlights the only source of light. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. And then my phone buzzed. Another text. You were warned. I didn't go home that night. I ended up driving to a 24-hour diner a few towns over, where I sat in a booth with a cup of coffee and tried to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. The journal was still with me, and every time I looked at it, I felt like it was staring back at me, mocking me. By the time the sun came up, I'd made a decision. I needed to find out the truth. Whatever Eric had gotten himself into, Whatever he'd been trying to expose, I wasn't going to let it die with him. I know that sounds stupid, especially after everything that happened, but I couldn't just walk away. Not now. Before I left the diner, I pulled out the map and took one last look at the red X. Even though it didn't show up online anymore, I knew exactly where it was, and I was going to find it. The drive to Nevada was supposed to take about 6 hours, but with how paranoid I felt, it ended up taking closer to 10. I kept checking my mirrors, convinced I was being followed. Every car that stayed behind me for more than a few minutes felt suspicious. Every gas station I stopped at felt like it was crawling with eyes. The journal sat on the passenger seat, a constant reminder of the rabbit hole I'd willingly dived into. By the time I crossed into Nevada, the landscape had shifted into an endless stretch of sand and scrub. I was heading toward the coordinates from the journal, and even though my GPS showed it as nothing but empty desert, I knew Eric had been there. He had found something. The road eventually turned into a dirt trail, then nothing at all. I parked my car on the side of what might have once been a path and got out, the dry heat hitting me like a wall. I had a cheap backpack with water, a flashlight, and the journal, like that was going to protect me if things went south. The red X from the map was still burned into my mind, and I started walking in its direction. The desert is weird, man. Quiet. Too quiet. No cars, no wind, just the sound of my boots crunching against the sand. After about 30 minutes, I noticed something strange. The further I walked, the quieter it got. I don't just mean no birds or animals. I mean nothing. Not even the faint sound of my footsteps. It was like someone had hit mute on the world around me. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a mirage, a shimmer in the distance. But as I got closer, I realized it was real. A black structure, half buried in the sand, like some kind of bunker or entrance. It didn't look abandoned, though. The edges were too clean, too sharp, like it had been built recently. There were no markings, no signs, no way to tell what it was. Just a solid black door with a keypad next to it. Eric had written about this. One of his last entries mentioned finding an access point, but said the code was impossible to guess. I stood there, staring at the keypad, feeling a weird mix of excitement and dread. This was it. The thing he'd been searching for. But what was I supposed to do now? As I debated whether to try random numbers or turn back, I heard the sound. It started as a low hum, like the one from my car, but it was louder now, almost vibrating through the air. I turned around, expecting to see headlights, or maybe even a helicopter, but there was nothing. Just empty desert. The sound kept getting louder though, and I realized it wasn't coming from a machine. It was coming from beneath me. The ground felt wrong, almost like it was buzzing. I stepped back, my eyes darting to the door. The keypad lit up suddenly, flashing a series of numbers. 7, 4, 2, 3, 1. I didn't think. I just punched them in. The door hissed open, revealing a staircase that led down into darkness. Every instinct told me to leave, to run back to my car, and forget any of this had ever happened. But then I thought about Eric, about his sketch of the thing outside his window, about his last message. They know. I couldn't walk away now, not without finding out what happened to him. I pulled out my flashlight and started down the stairs. The air inside was cold, almost unnaturally so, and the deeper I went, the harder it was to breathe. The walls were made of smooth black metal, and they didn't reflect light the way they should have. My flashlight's beam felt weaker in there, like the darkness was swallowing it whole. The hum was louder now, more rhythmic, like a pulse. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a hallway. It stretched endlessly in both directions, dimly lit by these faint, blue lights embedded in the floor. I picked a direction and started walking, my footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. Every so often, I passed doors, thick metal ones with no handles or windows, just small panels with glowing green lights. I tried pushing on a few of them, but they wouldn't budge. And then I saw the first smear. It was on the floor, a dark, rusty stain that trailed off down the hallway. My stomach turned as I realized what it probably was, but I kept moving. The hum was louder here, almost like it was coming from inside the walls. I swear, I could feel it in my teeth. About 50 feet down, I came across another door, but this one was different. It was open just a crack, and the light on its panel was flickering. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I nudged it open with my foot, flashlight ready, and stepped inside. The room was small, barely bigger than a closet, and filled with equipment I didn't recognize. Monitors, wires, strange machines that looked like they belonged in a sci-fi movie. But what caught my attention was the table in the middle of the room. Something was lying on it, covered with a thin gray sheet. I didn't want to look. I told myself not to look, but my legs moved on their own. I grabbed the edge of the sheet and pulled it back. It wasn't human. The thing on the table was pale and slender, with elongated limbs, and those same black, almond-shaped eyes Eric had drawn in his journal. Its skin looked too thin, like it might tear if you touched it, and its mouth, if you could call it that, was just a thin, vertical slit. The worst part? Its chest was moving, slowly, rhythmic. It was breathing. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. That's when I noticed the small device on the table next to it. It looked like a recorder with a blinking red light. I picked it up with shaking hands and pressed play. A voice crackled through the speaker, low and distorted, but I recognized it immediately. It was Eric. "If you're hearing this, I'm probably dead," he said. "But it's not because of them. Not directly. I went too far. I found something I shouldn't have, and now there's no way out. If you've made it this far, you need to leave. Destroy the journal. Forget everything." The recording cut out suddenly, replaced by static. I stood there, frozen, until the hum outside the room grew louder. It wasn't just a noise anymore. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I turned off the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding as the footsteps stopped right outside the door. For a moment, everything was silent again. Then, the door creaked open. I held my breath as the door opened wider, the sound painfully loud in the heavy silence. My back was pressed against the cold wall, every muscle locked in place. My flashlight was off, but the dim blue glow from the hallway outside seeped into the room, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. I didn't want to look. I didn't dare look. But some primal part of me needed to know what was standing there. It wasn't a person. The thing that stepped into the doorway was tall, at least 7 feet, and unnervingly thin. Its arms hung low, almost brushing the floor, and its head was slightly tilted, like it was trying to listen for something. The blue light from the hallway reflected off its skin, which was pale and waxy, almost translucent. But the worst part? Its eyes. They weren't eyes at all, just empty black sockets. I don't know how I managed to stay silent, but I did. My body felt like it wasn't even mine, like I'd been disconnected from it completely. The thing took another step into the room, its head snapping toward the table where the creature was lying. It made a noise, a low guttural clicking sound that sent shivers racing down my spine. Then it froze. For a moment, I thought maybe it hadn't noticed me, but then it turned its head sharply, directly toward where I was hiding. I could feel its gaze, or whatever it used to see, pinning me in place. My heartbeat was so loud I was convinced it could hear it. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and walked back into the hallway. I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like they'd turned to stone. The sound of its footsteps faded into the distance, swallowed by the hum that seemed to pulse through the walls. I forced myself to breathe again, each inhale shaky and uneven. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to get out of that place and never look back. But I didn't, because I noticed something on the table. Next to the recorder, half hidden beneath a stack of wires, was another piece of paper. It wasn't like the journal pages. It was cleaner, crisper, like someone had printed it out recently. I grabbed it with trembling hands and held it close to my flashlight, careful to keep the beam dim. It was a schematic, not of the building or the bunker. This was something else. It looked like a machine, but the design was all wrong. The shapes were too angular, too foreign. At the bottom of the page, in small blocky letters, was a single word, transposition, and beneath that, handwritten in a messier script, was a chilling note. Do not activate without containment. Do not activate without clearance. I didn't have time to process what it meant, because that's when I heard the voices. They were faint at first, echoing from somewhere deeper in the hallway. It wasn't like normal conversation. It was fragmented, like snippets of a broken radio transmission. Words would cut in and out, garbled and distorted, but they were unmistakably human. I shoved the schematic into my backpack and peeked out into the hallway, my heart pounding. The blue lights along the floor flickered faintly, casting the long, empty corridor in a surreal glow. I couldn't see anyone, but the voices were getting louder. They weren't coming from a single direction. They seemed to echo from all around me, like the walls themselves were speaking. I strained to pick out the words. Shouldn't be here. Protocol breach. Unstable. Contain the anomaly. I had no idea what they were talking about, but one thing was clear. I wasn't supposed to be there. I started moving down the hallway, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Every few steps, I would glance behind me, convinced that thing from before was following me. But the corridor stayed empty, the hum growing louder with every step. Then I reached the end of the hallway. The corridor opened into a massive room, far larger than I'd expected. The ceiling stretched so high, it disappeared into darkness, and the walls were lined with more of those black doors, each with a glowing green panel. In the center of the room was a circular platform, surrounded by thick cables that snaked across the floor and up into the walls. The hum was deafening here, vibrating through my chest, and on the platform was another creature. This one was different. It was larger than the one on the table, its body twisted and contorted like it had been frozen mid-transformation. Its skin was darker, almost metallic, and its limbs jutted out at unnatural angles. But it wasn't moving. It was contained inside some kind of transparent field, shimmering faintly in the light. I stepped closer, drawn to it despite every instinct screaming at me to stay back. That's when I saw the controls, an array of panels and buttons set into a console next to the platform. One of the screens was flashing red, displaying a single word over and over. Unstable. Eric's voice echoed in my head. I went too far. I found something I shouldn't have. Before I could process what I was looking at, the voices started up again, but this time, they weren't distant. They were right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight slicing through the darkness, but the room was empty. The voices, though, were deafening now, overlapping and layering on top of each other until they didn't even sound human anymore. My chest tightened, panic clawing at me. I turned back to the platform, desperate for something, anything, to make sense of what was happening. And then the hum stopped. The sudden silence was more jarring than the noise. It pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. I backed away from the platform, my hands trembling. That's when I noticed the shadows. They weren't mine. The light from the floor cast long, jagged shapes across the walls, shifting and twisting like they had a mind of their own. I turned toward the hallway, ready to bolt, but something blocked my path. It was the thing from before, the one with the empty eye sockets. But it wasn't alone this time. There were others, their forms barely visible in the dim light. They didn't move toward me. They just stood there, watching, their shapes flickering like static on an old TV. I stepped back, my foot hitting one of the cables. The thing on the platform let out a low, guttural sound, its body twitching violently. The field around it flickered, and the red light on the console turned green. The platform powered up. The hum returned, louder and more intense than ever. The creatures in the hallway started moving now, their steps slow and deliberate. I scrambled toward the console, my mind racing. The word from the schematic flashed in my brain. Transposition. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what the machine would do, but I didn't have a choice. The creatures were almost on me when I slammed my hand onto the largest button I could find. The second I hit the button, the hum turned into a roar, like the air itself was being torn apart. The room vibrated violently, and the light on the platform flared so bright it burned white hot, searing the edges of my vision. I stumbled backward, my ears ringing as the shimmering field around the creature collapsed. It moved. The thing on the platform, the twisted metallic figure, lurched upright with a sound like grinding metal. Its limbs unfolded unnaturally, bending in directions that made my stomach churn. I couldn't even process how tall it was, but its shadow stretched across the entire room, impossibly large. The static-like figures in the hallway froze, as if something about this new presence had even them afraid. The roar of the machine shifted, now pulsing in irregular waves, like a heartbeat gone wrong. And then it hit me. It wasn't the machine making that noise anymore. It was the thing on the platform. It turned toward me. Its face, or what passed for one, was nothing but a jagged, featureless void, like someone had erased it entirely. But I could feel it staring at me, piercing through me. My body locked up, muscles refusing to obey, as a deep, guttural vibration filled the room. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was more like a thought, but one that wasn't mine. You do not belong. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The static figures in the hallway began to move again, surging forward with jerky, unnatural motions. They didn't walk. They just blinked in and out, appearing closer each time. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but I was frozen, caught between the creature on the platform and the growing horde behind me. And then the platform surged again, a blast of heat and light that knocked me off my feet. The metallic figure let out a sound that was part roar, apart shriek, and the static figures disintegrated mid-step. They didn't fall or burn, they just blinked out, like a glitch in reality. I hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of my lungs, and scrambled backward as the figure stepped down from the platform. The hum in the air grew sharper, higher, like a frequency that shouldn't exist. My vision blurred, the edges of the room distorting as if the walls were folding inward. The creature was right in front of me now, its massive, twisted form blotting out everything else. It reached down, one long, jagged arm extending toward me, but it didn't touch me. Instead, it placed its hand, or claw, or whatever it was, on the backpack I'd been clutching. The hum instantly stopped. The air went still, heavy, as the figure straightened up, the backpack dangling from its claw-like fingers. It turned toward the hallway, the black void of its face somehow looking past me. "Not yours," it rumbled. Without warning, it threw the backpack into the air. It didn't fall. Instead, it hovered for a moment, twisting and turning, as if caught in an invisible wind. The journal spilled out, pages fluttering before disintegrating into ash. The schematic followed, crumpling into itself like paper burning without a flame. And then the backpack itself vanished, blinking out of existence as if it had never been there. The creature turned back to me. Forget. The word wasn't spoken. It was imprinted directly into my mind, like a command carved into my thoughts. And then it was gone. Just like that. One moment it was there, towering over me, and the next I was alone in the silent, empty room. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes, hours, maybe longer. The air was still thick, heavy with the memory of whatever had just happened. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me, and stumbled toward the hallway. It felt different now, less alive, more like an abandoned shell. The doors were all closed, their green panels now dim and lifeless. The hum was gone, replaced by a silence so complete it made my ears ring. I found the staircase and climbed it, on autopilot, my mind blank. When I reached the door at the top, it slid open effortlessly, revealing the blinding light of the desert sun. The fresh air hit me like a punch to the chest. I stumbled outside, shielding my eyes, and realized my car was still where I'd left it. The world looked normal, like nothing had happened, but something felt wrong, different. I got in the car and drove. It's been 3 days since I left the desert. I've barely slept, barely eaten. Every time I close my eyes, I see it, that void-like face, the way it seemed to pull reality apart just by existing. I keep expecting to wake up and find the journal sitting on my bedside table, mocking me. But it's gone, and so is everything I took with me. Even my phone is empty. The photos I'd taken of the map, the coordinates, all of it has been wiped clean. My search history doesn't show anything about Area 51 or Eric's conspiracies. It's like none of it ever happened. Like I never found the journal, never drove to the desert, never opened that door. But here's the thing. I know it was real, because Eric is still missing, and no one in my family remembers him. Not my mom, not my cousins, not even my aunt and uncle. It's like he was erased from existence, wiped clean just like the journal. When I brought him up during a family dinner last night, everyone just stared at me, confused. My aunt laughed and said, "You don't have a cousin named Eric, sweetie. Are you feeling okay?" I'm not okay. I'm not sure I'll ever be okay again. This morning, I woke up to a single text message on my phone. No number, no name, just the same message I'd gotten before. Stop. I don't know who or what is behind this, but if you're reading this, please, for your own sake, don't go looking for answers. Don't search for the coordinates. Don't dig into Area 51 conspiracies. And whatever you do, don't go into the desert. Some things aren't meant to be found. A brutal serial killer live streams his murders on the dark web. I recognized one of his victims. It's my neighbor. Okay, so before I get into this, I want to be super clear. I'm not one of those people who spends hours a day on the dark web. I've barely even dipped my toe into that cesspool, and honestly, after what happened, I wish I'd never gone near it. I know it's a cliche to start a story like this, but I swear I'm not making any of this up. It's been eating at me for weeks, and I need to get it off my chest. It started on a boring Saturday night. I was home alone, which is pretty much my default setting these days. My roommate Chris was out of town for a wedding, and the apartment felt way too quiet. I'd already cycled through Netflix, YouTube, and TikTok for hours, and nothing was holding my attention. That's when I remembered a conversation I'd had with a coworker a few weeks earlier. You know, that one guy in the office who's a little too into conspiracy theories. Yeah, that's Greg. He's harmless, but man, he can talk your ear off about aliens, secret government projects, and, you guessed it, the dark web. I joked about it with him, saying something dumb like, "Oh, maybe I'll check it out if I get bored enough." At the time, it was just a throwaway comment. But now, sitting there with nothing better to do, my curiosity got the better of me. I started Googling stuff like how to access the dark web safely, which in hindsight is the dumbest thing ever because it's like asking, how do I break into a house without getting caught? After about an hour of reading forums and downloading the Tor browser, I finally got it set up. My heart was pounding, even though I hadn't done anything yet. Just opening that browser made me feel like I was committing a felony. The first few sites I found were pretty boring. Lots of forums, old-school text-based marketplaces, and sketchy links promising everything from fake passports to illegal drugs. I was about to log off and chalk the whole thing up to a waste of time when I saw a link buried in a random thread. It was titled The Crimson Theater. Now, let me be clear. The dark web is full of clickbait nonsense. 90% of the time, you'll just get dead links or scam pages. But something about this one made my stomach twist. Maybe it was the way the person described it, like it was this secret, invitation-only thing. They said, once you enter the Crimson Theater, you don't leave the same. Yeah, it was melodramatic, but it hooked me. Against my better judgment, I clicked. The site loaded painfully slowly, which added to the whole creepy vibe. The screen went black for a few seconds, and I thought it had crashed, but then this blood-red text appeared. Welcome to the Crimson Theater. Watch at your own risk. Okay, not exactly subtle, but at this point, I was too far down the rabbit hole to back out. The page had a list of showtimes, each with a cryptic title: The Last Supper, Ashes to Ashes, Room 314. The next one was starting in 10 minutes. It was called The Garden. I debated with myself for a solid 5 minutes. My gut was screaming at me to close the browser and walk away, but my curiosity was stronger. I clicked the link, and the screen went dark again. This time, it stayed that way for a while, but I could hear faint sounds, like someone breathing heavily, or maybe footsteps on gravel. When the video finally loaded, my heart dropped into my stomach. The camera was focused on what looked like a dingy concrete basement. There was a single chair in the middle of the room, and a man was tied to it. His face was covered with a burlap sack, and he was shaking. Whether from fear or cold, I couldn't tell. A figure stepped into frame, and I swear, my blood ran cold. The guy was wearing a black hoodie with the hood pulled tight around his face. He had this weird, blank white mask that made him look like some discount version of Michael Myers. In one hand, he was holding a long, curved knife, and in the other, he had a piece of paper. He held the paper up to the camera, and I squinted to read the words written on it. "Welcome to the garden. The soil here is fed with fear and watered with blood." I was about to close the stream. I swear I was, when the guy pulled the burlap sack off the victim's head. That's when I froze. The man tied to the chair wasn't just some random stranger. It was my neighbor. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I even leaned closer to the screen, hoping I was wrong. But no, there was no mistaking it. The man tied to that chair, trembling and pale as a ghost, was Mr. Green, my neighbor from 4B. He's the kind of guy you don't really think about until he's standing right in front of you. Quiet, unassuming, probably in his late 50s. I'd see him every so often in the hallway, maybe nod at him or exchange a polite "good morning," but that was it. Now, here he was, bound and gagged, with terror etched on his face. My hand started shaking so badly that my laptop nearly slipped off my knees. I should have shut the stream off, right then and there. Called the cops, done something, but instead, I just sat there, frozen. It felt like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life. It was the kind of nightmare you'd see in a movie or read about online, but it wasn't supposed to land in your lap like this. The masked guy, the one I'd later start calling the gardener in my head, started circling Mr. Green like a predator sizing up its prey. He wasn't in a hurry. Every movement was slow, deliberate. His knife caught the dim light hanging from the ceiling, reflecting it in quick flashes that seemed to slice through the screen. "Are you ready to grow?" the gardener said, his voice low and gravelly, like someone who'd smoked one too many packs of cigarettes. The question didn't make any sense, and I could tell Mr. Green was just as confused as I was. He let out a muffled whimper through the gag in his mouth, shaking his head frantically. That's when the gardener crouched down, getting right in Mr. Green's face. He tilted his head, like he was studying him. The camera was positioned so close that I could see every little twitch in Mr. Green's expression, his wide, bloodshot eyes, the beads of sweat dripping down his temple. "I'll take that as a yes," the gardener said, almost cheerfully. The whole time I was sitting there, silently begging for someone, anyone, to burst through that basement door and put an end to this. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Whatever this was, it had been planned too carefully. The gardener was too calm, too methodical. He knew exactly what he was doing. He stood up and walked out of frame for a moment, leaving Mr. Green alone. I could hear the sound of something metallic being dragged across the floor, like chains or, I don't know, some kind of tool. When the gardener came back, he was holding a bucket. I don't know why, but the sight of that bucket filled me with a new kind of dread. It wasn't particularly large or unusual, just a plain, rusty metal pail, but it was what was inside that made my stomach churn. The camera was too far away to show it clearly, but it looked like soil. Dark, wet, clumpy soil. Every garden needs good soil, the gardener said, holding the bucket up for the camera like some kind of deranged cooking show host. Then he turned to Mr. Green. "And you, my friend, will be the perfect seed." What the hell was this guy even talking about? None of it made any sense, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. My hand hovered over the trackpad, ready to slam the browser shut at the first sign of, well, anything. But instead, I just sat there like an idiot, glued to the screen. The gardener set the bucket down and grabbed a handful of the soil. He let it sift through his fingers, sprinkling it onto the floor around Mr. Green like some kind of ritual. All the while, he was humming this creepy off-key tune that sent shivers down my spine. It sounded vaguely familiar, like an old nursery rhyme, but I couldn't quite place it. Then he reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out what looked like a small gardening spade. He held it up for the camera, turning it slowly so the blade caught the light. "A garden is only as good as its tools," he said, his tone almost mocking. "And this one's my favorite." At this point, Mr. Green was full on sobbing, his body shaking so violently that the chair scraped against the floor. He tried to say something through the gag, but it just came out as a garbled mess. The gardener didn't seem to care. He crouched down again, getting close enough that I could hear the faint rustle of his breath through the mosque. "Shh," he whispered, placing a gloved finger against Mr. Green's lips. "It's okay. You'll grow into something beautiful." I wanted to scream at my screen, to tell Mr. Green to fight, to kick, to do something. But all I could do was sit there, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Then the gardener raised the spade. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound it made when it hit flesh. It was wet, sickening, like someone stomping on a watermelon. I clapped a hand over my mouth, trying to hold back the bile rising in my throat. The camera stayed focused on Mr. Green, capturing every horrifying detail as the gardener worked. Blood started pooling on the floor, mixing with the soil, turning it into this dark, sludgy mess. But the worst part, the gardener was humming the entire time, that same off-key tune. I wanted to shut it off. I swear, I did. But I couldn't. It was like I was in a trance, hypnotized by the sheer horror of what I was witnessing. My mind kept screaming, "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the longer I watched, the more I realized there was no way this was fake. The raw emotion on Mr. Green's face, the tiny details, the way his body jerked with every strike, it was all too real. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The gardener stood up, wiping the spade clean with a rag. He turned to the camera, tilting his head again, like he was studying me this time. I swear, in that moment, it felt like he could see me through the screen. "You watched," he said, his voice low and menacing. "That means you're part of the garden now." Before I could react, the stream cut off, leaving me staring at a blank screen. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing. My neighbor was dead, murdered, and I just watched it happen. But the worst part, deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Not for me, not for the gardener. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the blank screen. Minutes, hours. Time didn't seem real anymore. My laptop's fan was humming loudly, like it was straining under the weight of what I'd just seen. The silence in my apartment was suffocating. It pressed down on me, thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Every instinct in my body told me to do something. Call the police. Call someone. Anyone. But how do you even start that conversation? "Hi," I just watched my neighbor get murdered on a dark web livestream. Yeah, that'd go over great. Besides, the moment I tried to explain how I'd stumbled onto the site, I'd probably end up on some watch list myself. I kept replaying the scene in my head, over and over, like some sick, looping horror show. The gardener's voice, that awful humming, the way he looked directly into the camera, and those last words. You're part of the garden now. The thought sent a shiver crawling up my spine. What did he mean by that? Was it just a sick taunt, or was it something worse? I felt like I was being watched, like he was still out there, somewhere, keeping tabs on me. I got up and checked every lock in my apartment, double and triple checking that they were secure. I even shoved a chair under the doorknob, for good measure, like some kid hiding from the boogeyman. But the thing about fear is that it doesn't care about locks. It seeps through the cracks, digging into your brain and whispering all the worst case scenarios you didn't even know you were afraid of. What if he could see me? What if there was some kind of tracker in that stream? A way for him to know who I was, where I lived. I tried to shake it off. Paranoia, I told myself. Just paranoia. But that little voice in the back of my head wouldn't shut up. What if it wasn't? Around 3 a.m., I finally convinced myself to go to bed, though sleep was out of the question. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Every little noise made me jump. The hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards, the faint whoosh of cars passing by outside. I kept glancing at my bedroom door, half expecting to see it slowly creak open, revealing a shadowy figure with a white mask. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I must have dozed off, but it wasn't restful. My dreams were fragmented, filled with flashes of the gardener's mask, the glint of his knife, and the sound of that haunting off-key humming. When I woke up, my heart was racing, and the taste of bile was sour in my mouth. I dragged myself out of bed and stumbled into the living room. The first thing I noticed was that my laptop was still open, the screen black, but still faintly glowing. I hesitated before touching it, half expecting something horrifying to pop up as soon as I moved the mouse. But the browser was closed, and there were no new tabs or messages, just the desktop background, a dumb picture of my roommate, Chris, pretending to be a cowboy at some theme park. I was about to shut it down completely when a soft, rhythmic sound caught my attention. Knock, knock. It was faint, almost tentative, like whoever was at the door didn't want to be heard. My stomach dropped. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Chris was still out of town. I sat there, frozen, staring at the door like it might come alive and swallow me whole. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was louder, more insistent. My first thought was that it was just someone from the building, a neighbor, maybe a package delivery. But then I remembered. Mr. Green was dead. I'd seen it. And if he was gone, who the hell would be knocking? I stood up slowly, my legs shaking like they were made of jelly. My phone was still on the coffee table, but I didn't reach for it. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to look away from the door. Maybe I was scared that if I blinked, something would happen. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. I swallowed hard and took a step closer, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The chair I'd wedged under the doorknob was still there, but it suddenly felt useless. The knocking stopped, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow, and the faint hum of the building's heating system. And then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, a voice came through the door. "You watched." It was low and gravelly, barely more than a whisper, but I recognized it instantly. The gardener. My vision blurred for a second, and I felt like I might pass out. My hands flew to the chair under the doorknob, pressing it tighter against the doorframe, even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how this was even possible. How could he know where I lived? How could he? "I know you're in there," the voice said, cutting through my thoughts like a knife. "Open the door. Let's talk." I didn't respond. Couldn't respond. My throat felt like it was closing up, and my chest was so tight I thought I might suffocate. The gardener laughed, a low, humorless chuckle that made my skin crawl. "You're part of the garden now. There's no running from it, no hiding. But I'm feeling generous today. If you open the door, I might go easy on you." I backed away, my eyes darting around the room, looking for something, anything I could use as a weapon. A lamp, a kitchen knife, hell, even a heavy book. But my hands were trembling so badly that I wasn't sure I'd be able to hold on to anything. "I can hear you breathing," he said. "Don't make me come in there." That was it. Something inside me snapped, and I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling over the screen as I dialed 911. The ringing felt like it went on forever, but finally an operator picked up. "911, what's your emergency?" "There's someone at my door," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He's trying to get in. Before I could finish, the knocking started again. This time, it was furious, loud enough to rattle the door in its frame. "Who's at your door, sir?" the operator asked, her voice calm but firm. "I don't know his name," I said, my voice cracking. "But he killed my neighbor. I saw it. A loud crash interrupted me, and I nearly dropped the phone. The gardener wasn't knocking anymore. He was kicking. The door frame splintered with each hit, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he got in. "Stay on the line," the operator said. "Officers are on their way." But would they get here in time? I wasn't so sure. I retreated to my bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My breath was coming in ragged gasps now, and I could barely hold onto the phone. The gardener's kicks echoed through the apartment, each one louder than the last. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I sat there in the dark, clutching the phone like it was a lifeline, waiting for something, anything. But the only sound was the faint buzzing of the line as the operator tried to reassure me. That's when I heard it, the humming. It was coming from inside the apartment. The humming was faint at first, so soft I thought it might be in my head. But as I sat there, clutching the phone with the white-knuckled fingers, it grew louder. It was the same eerie, off-key tune the gardener had hummed during the stream. My chest felt tight, like someone had reached inside and started squeezing my lungs. "Sir, are you still there?" The operator's voice crackled through the phone, cutting through the haze of fear. He's in here," I whispered. My voice sounded hollow, like it wasn't even mine. I couldn't tell if I was speaking out loud or just mouthing the words. "He's inside. We have officers en route," she said. "Stay where you are. Do not engage. Help is on the way." Her voice felt distant, irrelevant. How could help be on the way when I could hear the gardener's haunting tune right outside my bedroom door? It wasn't possible. The door to my apartment hadn't opened, I would have heard it, but none of that mattered now. He was here. Somehow, he was here. The humming stopped. Silence settled over the apartment, thick and suffocating. I stared at the thin line of light under my bedroom door, praying I wouldn't see shadows pass by. My phone was still clutched in one hand, but I barely registered the operator's voice anymore. Every muscle in my body was frozen, my ears straining to pick up even the faintest sound. And then I heard it. A slow, deliberate scrape. It sounded like metal dragging across the floor. The spade. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside my door. I bit down on my lip so hard, I tasted blood, trying to keep from making any noise. If he didn't know I was in here, maybe, just maybe, he'd go away. The doorknob rattled. I almost screamed. My hand flew to my mouth, clamping down hard to stifle the sound. The knob twisted back and forth, slow at first, then harder, more insistent. The lock held, but it didn't feel like much of a barrier. The flimsy wood door might as well have been paper. Still hiding? The gardener's voice seeped through the door like oil, thick and cold. You can't hide forever. A seed buried in darkness always grows toward the light. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up, to realize this was all some terrible dream. But when I opened them, the door was still there, rattling against the lock, and the gardener was still speaking. "Did you enjoy the show?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "You couldn't look away, could you? Couldn't stop watching him bleed?" The rattling stopped, and for a moment, I thought he might have left. But then came a new sound, a soft, rhythmic thudding. I realized, with a sickening jolt, that he was digging. I could hear the scrape of the spade against the floor, followed by the dull thud of soil being dumped. "What are you doing?" I wanted to scream the question, but it came out as a barely audible whisper. "I'm planting," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "This is the garden, after all, and you're the soil." I don't know how I kept myself from passing out. My hands were trembling so violently that I nearly dropped the phone. I pressed it to my ear, hoping, praying, that the operator was still there. "Officers are entering the building now," she said. "Stay on the line. They'll be there in minutes." Minutes. It might as well have been hours. The gardener wasn't giving me minutes. The digging stopped, and the room fell silent again. I braced myself for the worst, waiting for the door to burst open. But instead, I heard something even more unnerving. The sound of footsteps, walking away. Slow, deliberate, like he was taking his time. I listened as they faded into the distance, growing softer and softer until they were gone entirely. For a moment, I thought he'd left the apartment. Relief started to wash over me, but it was short-lived. I realized the room felt different. The air was heavy, damp, like a greenhouse. And then I noticed the smell, earthy, wet, like fresh soil. I looked down and nearly dropped the phone. My bedroom floor wasn't hardwood anymore. It was dirt. Thick, dark soil stretched out beneath me, swallowing my bare feet. I scrambled back, pressing myself against the wall, but the soil seemed to follow me. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But the more I moved, the more the ground seemed to shift and churn, like it was alive. "You're part of the garden now," the gardener's voice echoed, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me, wrapping around me like vines. The light under the door was gone. Instead, there was a faint, reddish glow seeping through the cracks, pulsing like a heartbeat. The air grew hotter, thicker, and I could feel sweat dripping down my face. My phone slipped from my fingers, landing in the dirt with a soft thud, and then I saw it. A hand. It shot up from the soil, pale and skeletal, grasping blindly at the air. Then another, and another. They clawed their way out, dragging bodies behind them. Faces emerged, blank and expressionless, their eyes black voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. One of them turned its head toward me. Its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. I recognized the face. Mr. Green. My body moved before my brain could catch up. I scrambled to my feet and threw myself at the door, yanking it open and bolting into the hallway. The walls were covered in that same pulsing reddish light, and the floor beneath me felt soft, like I was running on moss. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't need to. I could hear them behind me, the scraping, shuffling sounds of dirt-covered bodies clawing their way closer. Somehow, I made it to the front door of the apartment. It was wide open, and outside, I could see flashing red and blue lights. The police. I stumbled out, gasping for air, and nearly collapsed on the floor. 2 officers rushed toward me, their voices a blur. I tried to tell them about the gardener, about Mr. Green, but all that came out were broken fragments of sentences. When they finally calmed me down enough to go back inside, the apartment was normal. The floors were hardwood, the air was clear, and the door to my bedroom was still locked. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know this isn't over. The officers stayed with me for hours that night, but they were useless. They checked every corner of the apartment, every room, every closet. Their flashlights swept over the floors, walls, and ceilings, finding nothing but the ordinary signs of my uneventful life. No dirt, no glowing red light, no signs of forced entry. Even the door frame, which I was certain had been splintered under the gardener's kicks, was intact. One of the officers, a younger guy with kind eyes, tried to reassure me. "Sometimes stress can play tricks on the mind," he said. "Maybe you just imagined it." Imagined it? The idea made my skin crawl. How could I explain the smell of the soil, the way it clung to my feet, the sight of Mr. Green's face staring back at me, grinning that awful, impossible grin? But there was no proof, nothing to back me up. I wanted to scream, to grab them by the shoulders and beg them to believe me, but I knew it wouldn't help. After a while, they gave me a card with a number to call if anything else happens, and left me alone in the quiet, too clean apartment, alone with the silence. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. I sat on the couch with every light in the apartment turned on, clutching the biggest kitchen knife I could find. Every sound made me jump, every creak, every groan of the pipes, every faint rustle of the wind outside. But nothing happened. The hours dragged by, slow and suffocating, until the pale light of dawn started creeping through the windows. I should have felt relief, but instead, I just felt empty, number. It was like my brain couldn't process what had happened, or maybe it didn't want to. But deep down, I knew I wasn't safe. The gardener wasn't just some deranged lunatic. He wasn't just a man with a mask and a spade. He was something else, something worse, and he wasn't done with me. Over the next few days, I tried to go back to normal, or at least pretend to. I went to work. I went grocery shopping. I even binge-watched a stupid sitcom to distract myself. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd catch myself, glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that blank white mask, in every shadow. And then the messages started. It was subtle at first. A small plain envelope slipped under my door one morning. Inside was a single piece of paper with 2 words scrawled across it in red ink. Keep watching. I nearly dropped it when I saw the words. My first instinct was to run out into the hallway and confront whoever had left it, but there was no one there. Just the empty corridor and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. The next day, it was an email. No sender, no subject line, just a single image embedded in the body of the message. It was a photo of my apartment building, taken from across the street. My apartment, my window. That's when I knew. He was here, watching, waiting. I stopped going to work after that. I couldn't leave the apartment, not because it felt safer, but because I couldn't shake the fear that he'd be waiting for me out there. Every day, I'd sit by the window, peering through the blinds, searching for any sign of him, a flash of movement, a shadow that didn't belong, anything. The messages kept coming, texts, emails, even a voicemail at one point. Each one was worse than the last. A photo of my bedroom taken from just outside the window. A recording of that haunting off-key humming. A single text that read, "The soil is ready." It was the 5th day after the live stream when I finally broke. My phone buzzed in the middle of the night, jolting me awake from a restless sleep. The message was simple. Come see the garden. And there was a link. I knew I shouldn't click it. I knew it was a trap, but my hand moved on its own, trembling as I tapped the screen. The browser opened, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the screen went black, and a familiar red text appeared. Welcome back to the Crimson Theater. The stream loaded, and my stomach turned to ice. The camera was focused on my apartment door. I could see the number, 4D, clear as day. Someone was standing in front of it, holding a spade. The gardener. It wasn't a recording. It was live. My breath caught in my throat as he raised a hand and knocked. Knock, knock, knock. The same deliberate rhythm as before. I dropped the phone, stumbling backward, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But then I realized I could hear something else. The knock, not through the phone, but here, in my apartment. I looked toward the door, and my blood ran cold. The knocking wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside my bedroom closet. I backed away, my legs shaking so badly that I could barely stand. The knocking stopped, replaced by the slow, deliberate creak of the closet door opening. The air in the room grew heavy, stifling, like I was suffocating under an invisible weight. And then he stepped out. The gardener. He was taller than I'd thought, his frame looming in the dim light. The mask was the same, white, featureless, impossibly blank, but it was his presence that froze me in place. It was like the air around him bent and twisted, warping reality itself. "You've grown nicely," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "but every garden needs pruning." I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The soil was back, rising up around my ankles, pulling me down. I struggled, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The gardener crouched down in front of me, tilting his head like he was admiring his handiwork. "You watched," he said softly. "You nourished the garden with your fear. And now, it's time to harvest." The last thing I remember is the sound of that spade scraping against the floor, followed by the soft, wet thud of soil being turned. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. The doctors said I'd been found unconscious in my apartment, surrounded by overturned furniture and dirt. They didn't have an explanation. Neither did the police. Mr. Green's apartment was still empty. No body, no evidence, no proof that any of it had happened. The officers who found me said my front door had been locked from the inside. But I know the truth. The gardener isn't done. I can still hear him at night, humming that awful off-key tune. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, I can smell the soil. I think he's waiting. For what? I don't know. But I know one thing for sure. I'm part of the garden now. And so are you. I'm a park ranger in the Rocky Mountains. A dark web post claimed. There's a lab hidden in the caves near my station. Last night, I heard screams echoing from the mountains. Hey, everyone. This is the kind of thing I never thought I'd write, let alone share publicly. But I need to get it out there while it's still fresh. If something happens to me, maybe someone will find this and piece it all together. I've been a park ranger in the Rocky Mountains for about 5 years now. It's the dream job for someone like me who loves the outdoors and has no problem being isolated for weeks at a time. Sure, there are lonely nights and the occasional bear encounter that gets the adrenaline pumping, but nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever freaked me out as much as what I'm about to tell you. It all started a few weeks ago during one of my regular shifts at the ranger station. Let me paint a picture for you. The station is a small wooden cabin with a big front porch, tucked away on the edge of a forest clearing. There's no Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and the only sounds at night are the wind in the trees and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. For most people, that's probably nightmare fuel. For me, it's home. On slow nights, I usually kill time scrolling through my phone, reading whatever I've saved offline, or dabbling in weird internet forums. It's like a guilty pleasure of mine. I've seen it all. UFO sightings, cryptid photos, ghost stories. Most of it is laughably fake, but every once in a while, you find something that sticks with you. That night, I was bored out of my mind and decided to dive into some obscure threads I'd bookmarked a while back. I can't remember exactly how I ended up on the deep web forum. Don't ask me what I was doing there. I honestly don't know. It was one of those things where you click and scroll mindlessly, going deeper and deeper until you find something that makes your stomach drop. The post I found was titled, Government Experimentation Lab Hidden in Rocky Mountain Caves. Avoid at all costs. The author went by the name Ravenwatcher76, and their profile was as sketchy as you'd expect. No photo, no posts, other than this one, and the account had been created just hours before. Here's the gist of what the post said. According to Ravenwatcher, back in the early 2000s, a secret government lab was built in one of the cave systems in my area. They claimed to have worked as a contractor for some shadowy organization, no names of course, and said the lab had been used for classified research. They didn't go into specifics, but they hinted at bioengineering, genetic experiments, and even psychological testing on unwilling subjects. If you're thinking sci-fi movie levels of creepy, you're on the right track. Here's where it got weirder. Ravenwatcher said the lab had been abandoned years ago after something got loose. That's all they wrote about it. Just those 3 words. The way they said it gave me chills. They didn't explain what something was, but they warned that anyone who stumbled upon the lab might not make it out alive. The post went on to describe landmarks near the supposed lab And this is where my skepticism started to crack. They mentioned specific features that were way too accurate for someone who'd never been here. The cluster of pines near Deadwood Trail, the way the cave entrance was hidden behind a ridge that looks like a giant staircase, and even a weirdly shaped boulder that locals call the Sentinel. I know those places. I've patrolled that area dozens of times. The Sentinel is less than 5 miles from my station. It's not a place you'd know about unless you'd actually been out there. At the end of the post, Raven Watcher included one final warning. If you hear strange noises at night, stay away. It's better not to look. And if you find it, don't go inside. Some doors should stay locked. Then they signed off with a single phrase. They're still watching. I should have closed the page right there. Instead, I found myself staring at the screen, rereading the post like it was a puzzle I needed to solve. It was ridiculous, right? Just another crazy conspiracy theory. But the level of detail, the familiarity of those landmarks, it got under my skin in a way I couldn't explain. The thing is, I've always had this uneasy feeling about those caves. Even before reading the post, I avoided going near them unless I absolutely had to. There's something about them that feels wrong, like they're alive and waiting for you to make a mistake. I always chalked it up to the natural eeriness of being alone in the wilderness, but after reading that post, I couldn't shake the idea that there might be more to it. I told myself to forget about it. It's just an internet rabbit hole, I thought. But that night, as I was locking up the station and heading back to my cabin, I couldn't stop looking toward the ridge where Deadwood Trail begins. The wind had picked up, and the forest was dark, the kind of dark where your flashlight barely makes a dent. For the first time in years, I felt watched. It was 3 days after I found that post when things started to get strange. At first, it was nothing I couldn't rationalize. Little things. But as I sit here now, thinking about everything that's happened, I'm not so sure anymore. I think it all started that same night I read the post. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy. I'm used to sleeping like a rock, no pun intended, out here. But something about that night had been off. I had the kind of dreams you can't quite remember, but you wake up unsettled, like your subconscious knows something you don't. I brushed it off as nerves from the weirdness of the post. I'm not usually the type to get spooked, but this had gotten under my skin more than I wanted to admit. That day was uneventful. I did my usual patrols, checked the Firewatch Tower, cleared a few fallen branches from the trails, and made sure the camping sites were empty. No one had been out there in days, and honestly, that's how I like it. People tend to bring trouble with them, especially when they don't respect the wilderness. But by late afternoon, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious. The forest just seemed quieter than usual. Normally, you hear birds, the rustle of squirrels, maybe the buzz of insects. But that day, it was like the whole place was holding its breath. Even the wind through the pines felt muffled. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the tension coiling in my chest. Around dusk, I headed back to the station to file my reports and settle in for the night. That's when I noticed the door. Let me clarify. I lock the station every time I leave. Always. It's not just protocol, it's habit. But as I got closer, I could see the door was slightly ajar. Not open enough to be obvious, just a crack, like it had been pushed, but not fully shut. My first thought was that maybe I'd screwed up and forgotten to lock it that morning, but I knew that wasn't true. I remember locking it. My second thought was that maybe someone had broken in. It wouldn't be the first time I've had to deal with trespassers, but this felt different. I stood on the porch for a few seconds, listening. The clearing around the station was bathed in twilight, long shadows stretching from the trees. Everything was silent except for the faint creak of the door swaying slightly in the breeze. I stepped inside slowly, one hand on my flashlight and the other resting on the can of bear spray clipped to my belt. The station isn't big, just one main room, with a desk, a radio, and a small kitchenette. Nothing looked out of place at first glance, but the air felt heavy, like the kind of humidity you get before a thunderstorm. I did a quick sweep, checked the storage closet, and looked under the desk. Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I checked the door frame and saw faint scratches near the lock, like someone had tried to jimmy it open. Not deep enough to do real damage, but noticeable if you were looking for them. I thought about calling it in, but what would I say? Hey, I think someone maybe kind of tried to break into the station, but didn't really do anything. It felt like overkill. So, I locked the door again, double-checked this time, and tried to move on. That night, I heard the screams for the first time. It was just after midnight. I'd been lying in bed, reading an old paperback with my radio on, low in the background. The cabin where I sleep is about 300 yards from the station, tucked into the edge of the forest. Normally, I feel safe there. The walls are thick, the windows have sturdy shutters, and the place is far enough from the main trails that I don't have to worry about random hikers stumbling in. But that night, safety felt like an illusion. The first scream came out of nowhere. It echoed through the mountains, sharp and jagged, like the sound had been ripped out of someone's throat. It wasn't close, maybe a mile away, up near the ridge, but it was loud enough to make me sit up straight in bed. My first instinct was that it was an animal. Cougars and bobcats can make sounds that will chill you to the bone if you don't know what they are. But this was different. There was a human quality to it, something raw and terrified. I sat there for a moment, straining to hear more, and then it came again. This time, it was closer. The scream was higher pitched, almost like a wail, and it lasted longer than the first. I grabbed my flashlight and threw on my boots, every nerve in my body on high alert. Part of me wanted to stay inside, lock the door, and pretend I hadn't heard it. But that's not how this job works. If there's someone out there, lost, injured, or worse, it's my responsibility to find them. I radioed the main ranger base to let them know I was heading out to investigate a possible distress call. No response. That wasn't unusual. Signal can be spotty out here, but it still added to my unease. I grabbed my pack, clipped my beer spray to my belt, and headed out into the night. The forest was pitch black, my flashlight barely cutting through the shadows. Every step felt like it echoed, even though the ground was soft with pine needles. The air was colder than it should have been, and as I made my way toward the ridge, I noticed something else. The silence. No crickets, no owls, not even the faint rustle of leaves, just the crunch of my boots and the distant hum of blood pounding in my ears. It was the kind of quiet that feels wrong, like the whole forest was holding its breath. About halfway up the ridge, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was something on the trail ahead of me, a shape crouched low to the ground. My first thought was that it was a bear, but as I shone my flashlight on it, I realized it wasn't. It was a man, or at least It looked like a man. He was hunched over, facing away from me, his back rising and falling in shallow breaths. His clothes were filthy, torn in places, and his arms hung at strange angles, like his joints didn't work right. I called out to him, my voice steady but firm. "Sir, are you okay? Do you need help?" He didn't respond. He didn't even move. That's when I noticed his hands. They weren't hands anymore. Not really. The fingers were too long, the nails blackened and curved like claws. And his skin, it looked like it had been stretched too tight, pale and shiny in the beam of my flashlight. Before I could take another step, he turned his head toward me. His face was wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. His eyes were too large, reflecting the light like an animal's, and his mouth, God, his mouth, was full of teeth that didn't belong in a human jaw. He smiled at me, and then he screamed. I stood frozen, my flashlight shaking in my hand as the thing on the trail screamed at me. It wasn't just a scream, it was a sound that cut through me like a knife, a guttural, distorted howl that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. It felt wrong, like something that shouldn't exist in this world. My brain was firing on all cylinders, scrambling to process what I was looking at, but none of it made sense. The creature, or the man, or whatever it was, stopped screaming as abruptly as it started. Its head tilted to the side, jerking unnaturally, like it was studying me. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that eerie silence. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. It was like my legs had turned to lead. Then it moved. It didn't stand up or crawl toward me like I expected. It scuttled, low to the ground, its limbs bending at impossible angles, its movements jerky and too fast for something that size. I took a step back, almost tripping over a root, and that's when the beam of my flashlight landed on its face again. It wasn't smiling anymore. Its mouth was open wide, too wide, its jaw unhinged like a snake's. For a split second, I thought I saw something moving inside its throat, writhing and pulsing like a nest of worms. That's when I finally snapped out of my paralysis. I turned and ran. I've never run so hard in my life. My boots pounded against the trail, the flashlight bouncing in my grip as I sprinted back down the ridge. The thing didn't chase me, at least not right away. But as I put distance between us, I heard it again. The sound of its claws scraping against the rocks, the rustling of branches as it moved through the underbrush. It wasn't following the trail. It was cutting through the forest, keeping pace with me in the dark. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I did, I'd freeze again, and this time, I wouldn't be lucky enough to snap out of it. My only goal was to get back to the station. The forest around me blurred into a mass of shadows and shapes, the trees whipping past as I barreled downhill. I thought I could hear the thing laughing, this horrible, guttural wheeze that sent chills racing down my spine. But maybe that was just my imagination. At least, that's what I told myself. By the time I reached the clearing, my lungs were on fire, and my legs felt like they were about to give out. The station was just ahead, its porch light glowing faintly through the trees. I stumbled up the steps, fumbling with my keys, my hands trembling so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. I slammed it shut behind me, locked it, and collapsed against it, gasping for breath. For a moment, there was silence. No scraping claws, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my ragged breathing and the faint hum of the radio on the desk. I started to think maybe I'd lost it, that maybe it had given up. and then the laughter started again. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the radio. I scrambled to my feet, staring at the old two-way set. The dial was still set to the Ranger frequency, but the laughter didn't sound like anything human. It was garbled, distorted, like it had been run through a dozen filters before coming out the other side. And underneath it, I could hear something else. Whispers, too quiet to make out the words, but loud enough to send a fresh wave of fear coursing through me. I grabbed the radio and switched it off, but the laughter didn't stop. It just changed. It shifted in pitch, turning into a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to resonate in my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the power cord out of the wall and threw the whole thing onto the floor. The sound stopped. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the broken radio, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I felt like the whole station was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard the knock. It was soft at first, just a gentle tap against the door behind me. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 sharp, deliberate raps, like whoever or whatever was on the other side wanted me to know it was there. I didn't move. My hand was still gripping the flashlight, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the shadows on the floor, but the knock came again, and again, and again. Each time it got louder, more insistent, until it wasn't knocking anymore. It was pounding. The door shook with each hit, the wood creaking under the strain. I backed away, my mind racing. There was no way it could get in. The door was solid, reinforced for bare protection, and the lock was strong. But the pounding didn't stop. It got faster, more frantic, like whatever was outside was throwing its whole weight against the door. And then it stopped. Silence. No laughter, no whispers, no pounding. Just the sound of my own breathing, loud and uneven in the stillness. I waited, barely daring to move, my flashlight pointed at the door. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. Finally, I worked up the courage to approach the door. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear anything on the other side. Nothing. I reached for the peephole, hesitating for a moment before leaning in to look. The clearing outside was empty. The porch light cast long shadows across the ground, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe the stress of the past few days had finally gotten to me. And then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the light, standing at the tree line, was a figure. It was too far away to make out any details, but I knew it was the same thing I'd seen on the trail. It didn't move. It didn't scream. It just stood there, watching, its head tilted to the side, and even from that distance, I could feel its gaze boring into me. And then, slowly, it raised one hand. It waved. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. After I saw that thing wave at me from the tree line, I locked every door and window in the station and stayed in the corner with my flashlight and bear spray clutched in my hands. I kept waiting for it to come closer, to pound on the door again, or worse. But the clearing stayed quiet. Every so often, I'd get up and peer through the peephole, but it was gone. Or at least, I thought it was. Part of me knew it was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting, watching. The sun finally rose, pale and weak through the trees, and with it came a small sense of relief. Whatever that thing was, It seemed tied to the night. At least I hoped it was. I'd survived until morning. That had to count for something. Right. I spent the better part of the day trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it all. Sleep deprivation, stress, maybe even the altitude messing with my head. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The scratches on the station door were real. The broken radio was real. And the wave, that wasn't something I could explain away. As the hours passed, I debated what to do. Calling for help seemed like the obvious choice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever answered wouldn't believe me, or worse, they would. What if this thing wasn't just some freak of nature? What if it was connected to that post, to whatever had been buried in those caves? By mid-afternoon, my curiosity had overtaken my fear. I needed answers. If I didn't figure out what was going on, I knew I'd never be able to live with myself. So, I decided to go back into the forest. But this time, I wasn't going in blind. I started by digging through the old maps we keep at the station. Most of them are standard issue. Trails, campsites, the usual stuff. But there's one map that's different. It's older, hand-drawn, and only used for internal purposes. It shows the less traveled parts of the forest, the places most hikers aren't supposed to go. And it includes the caves. There were 5 marked on the map, scattered across a wide area. Most of them were labeled with boring names, like Cave A or West Ridge Cavern, but one stood out. It was tucked away near Deadwood Trail, the same area the post had described. Next to it, someone had scrawled a single word in red ink. Hazard. I stared at that word for a long time. I'd been near that cave before, but I'd never gone inside. None of the rangers had. We were told during training that it was unstable, prone to collapses, and strictly off limits. But now, looking at the map, I couldn't help but wonder if that was the whole story. The coordinates for the cave were burned into my mind as I packed my gear. Flashlight, spare batteries, a first aid kit, water, and of course, my bear spray. I wasn't about to go unprepared. I also grabbed the emergency satellite phone, were issued for extreme situations. It doesn't have a strong signal in the forest, but it's better than nothing. By the time I left the station, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. I told myself I'd just scout the area, get a look at the cave entrance, and head back before dark. That was the plan, anyway. The forest felt different as I made my way toward Deadwood Trail. The air was colder, the shadows longer, and the silence more oppressive than usual. Every crunch of my boots on the ground seemed deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. At least, nothing I could see. After about an hour, I reached the ridge where the map said the cave was located. The entrance was exactly where Ravenwatch's post had described, hidden behind a ridge that looked like a giant staircase. If I hadn't been looking for it, I would have walked right past it. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and surrounded by jagged rocks that jutted out like broken teeth. I stood there for a long time, staring at the cave. The sun was almost gone now, and the thought of going inside in the dark made my skin crawl. But I'd come this far. I had to know. Taking a deep breath, I switched on my flashlight and stepped into the mouth of the cave. The air inside was damp and stale, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my stomach turn. The walls were slick with condensation, and the ground was uneven, littered with rocks and debris. My flashlight cast long, flickering shadows that danced across the walls, making the space feel alive. As I moved deeper, the metallic smell grew stronger. I tried to tell myself it was just the natural smell of the cave, minerals or something, but it reminded me too much of blood. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing in some places and opening into small chambers in others. I marked my path with chalk as I went, just in case I needed to find my way back in a hurry. The deeper I went, the more the walls began to change. The rough, natural stone gave way to something smoother, almost polished, and then I saw the first marking. It was carved into the wall, faint but unmistakable, a series of concentric circles with jagged lines radiating outward. I ran my fingers over it, feeling the grooves etched into the stone. It didn't look natural. Someone had put it there. My flashlight caught something glinting on the ground nearby. I crouched down and picked it up. A shard of glass, sharp and yellowed with age. It looked like it had once been part of a larger object, maybe a vial or a bottle. That's when I noticed the stains on the ground. Dark, reddish-brown stains, splattered across the stone, like something had been dragged through here. The metallic smell was almost overpowering now, and I had to fight the urge to gag. My instincts were screaming at me to turn back, but I pushed on. I needed to know what was at the end of this tunnel. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, the beam struggling to cut through the thick darkness. The walls here were covered in more markings, some carved, others painted in that same dark, reddish-brown substance. In the center of the chamber was a table, or what was left of one. It was metal, rusted and corroded, with straps dangling from its edges. The floor around it was littered with broken glass, rusted tools, and something that looked disturbingly like bone fragments. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost too quiet to notice, coming from deeper within the chamber. It was rhythmic, a soft, wet tapping, like something dripping onto stone. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, the beam catching movement just at the edge of the light. Something was there, crouched in the shadows. It was hunched low, its back to me, but I could see its limbs, long, thin, and wrong, bending in ways they shouldn't. Its skin was pale and stretched tight, and its head tilted to the side, as if listening. And then it turned. Its eyes glowed faintly in the beam of my flashlight, too large for its face, and its mouth stretched into that same impossibly wide grin I'd seen before. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, more shapes began to emerge from the darkness, their twisted forms moving toward me in jerky, unnatural motions. I ran like I had never run before. The sound of my boots slamming against the rocky floor echoed through the tunnel, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out the noise behind me. That wet, shuffling sound, the scraping of claws against stone, the guttural, choking laughter that seemed to reverberate from the walls themselves. Whatever those things were, they were coming after me, and they were getting closer. The tunnel twisted and turned, the chalk marks I'd left barely visible in the bouncing beam of my flashlight. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. I could feel them, just behind me, their presence pressing against my back like a physical weight. At one point, the tunnel narrowed, forcing me to duck and squeeze through a gap in the rocks. For a moment, I thought it might slow them down, give me a chance to gain some distance. But as I scrambled through to the other side, I glanced back and saw one of them crawling through the gap, its limbs folding and contorting in ways that defied logic. Its eyes glowed in the dark, and its grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that looked like broken glass. I didn't look back again. The metallic smell grew stronger the closer I got to the cave entrance, mixing with the coppery tang of my own sweat. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering and dimming, and for a horrifying moment, I was plunged into total darkness. I fumbled with it as I ran, slapping it against my palm until the light sputtered back to life. That's when I saw it, the mouth of the cave, a sliver of pale moonlight cutting through the darkness ahead. I was almost there, almost out. The laughter behind me grew louder, more frantic, and I realized they knew it too. They didn't want me to leave. I burst out of the cave, into the cold night air, tripping over the uneven ground and sprawling onto my hands and knees. For a moment, I just lay there, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. The forest around me was silent, the trees casting long shadows under the light of the moon. I scrambled to my feet and turned back toward the cave, expecting to see them pouring out after me. But the entrance was empty. The jagged rocks stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened, as if the horrors I'd seen inside were just a bad dream. But I knew better. I didn't wait to see if they would come out. I took off running, my legs screaming in protest as I sprinted down the ridge. I didn't bother with the trail. I just barreled through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and snagging on my clothes. My only goal was to get as far away from that cave as possible. By the time I reached the station, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I stumbled up the steps, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the lock. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, throwing the deadbolt for good measure. I collapsed onto the floor, my back against the door, and finally allowed myself to breathe. The events of the night played over and over in my mind, a chaotic jumble of images and sounds that refused to make sense. The glowing eyes, the twisted limbs, the laughter, and the chamber. I couldn't stop thinking about the chamber, the table, the markings on the walls, the stains on the floor. I didn't know what had happened in there, but I knew it wasn't anything good. And those things, they weren't natural. They weren't animals, or people, or anything else I could explain. They were wrong. As the sunlight poured through the station windows, I tried to convince myself I was safe, that whatever those things were, they couldn't follow me here. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The scratches on the door from the night before were proof enough. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I stayed inside, triple-checking the locks and peering out the windows every few minutes. I tried to call the main ranger base, but the radio was still broken, and the satellite phone wouldn't pick up a signal. I was completely cut off. By evening, I realized I couldn't stay there. Whatever was happening, I needed help. Real help. I packed a bag with as much food and water as I could carry, grabbed my flashlight and bear spray, and prepared to hike out to the nearest town. It was a 2-day trek through rough terrain, but I didn't have a choice. I waited until dusk, hoping the cover of darkness would keep me hidden from whatever was out there. As I stepped out onto the porch, the forest around me seemed unnaturally quiet, the air thick with tension. Every shadow looked like a figure, every rustle of leaves like the approach of something unseen. I'd made it about half a mile from the station when I noticed the smell, that same metallic coppery stench from the cave. It was faint at first, carried on the breeze, but it grew stronger with every step. I stopped, my flashlight sweeping over the trees searching for the source. And then I saw it. Carved into the trunk of a tree just ahead was one of the symbols from the cave. The concentric circles with jagged lines radiating outward, etched deep into the bark. My stomach turned as I realized the tree wasn't alone. There were more, stretching out in both directions, forming a rough perimeter around the station. I wasn't just being watched, I was being kept. Panic set in. I turned back toward the station, stumbling through the underbrush as the metallic smell grew stronger. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a physical weight. And then, as I broke through the tree line and into the clearing, I saw them. They were standing on the porch. 3 of them, their twisted forms silhouetted against the pale light of the moon. Their heads turned toward me in unison, and even from that distance, I could see their eyes glowing. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to move. One of them tilted its head, just like it had in the cave, and raised a long, clawed hand. It waved. That's the last clear memory I have. The rest is a blur. I remember running, the forest spinning around me, the sound of my own breathing deafening in my ears. I don't know how long I ran or where I went, but when I finally stopped, the sun was rising, and I was alone. I don't know how I made it out, but I did. I found my way to a road, flagged down a car, and eventually made it back to civilization. I reported what happened to my supervisors, but they didn't believe me. They wrote it off as stress, exhaustion, maybe even hallucinations from breathing in bad air in the cave. But I know what I saw. I quit my job the next day. I left the Rockies and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that laughter. And I know, deep down, that they're still out there, watching, waiting.